Hi there, I'm Jen, this is Remembered Reads, and this is going to be a wrap-up of some of the recent nonfiction that I've been reading. First up is a new release, and that is Disability Visibility, first-person stories from the 21st century. This was edited by Alice Wong, who has a website called Disability Visibility, who has a podcast of the same name. If you are interested in disability culture, disability rights, disability justice, and you're not following her on social media, you really should be, because she does bring together a lot of different people and a lot of information. This collects mostly newer articles, although not exclusively. It opens with Harriet Mcbride Johnson's fairly well-known piece where she describes meetings with Peter Singer, who, in addition to being the person who wrote Animal Liberation, is also someone who has suggested that parents should be allowed to kill their disabled children. And she was a lawyer who dealt with a lot of disability rights. If you haven't read her memoir, she passed away a few years ago, but if you haven't read her memoir, Too Late to Die Young, or her sort of young adult novel, Accidents of Nature, both of those are very worth reading. But I thought that was a great opening, even though that is more than 15 years old, just because it's such a good overall introduction to the kind of attitudes that people who don't pay attention to disability quote-unquote issues don't notice is out there in the culture, and then act shocked when things happen. This collects articles from people across the class and ethnic and disability spectrum in a way that I thought makes it a really great book to lend to people, which is definitely something I plan to do. Reading this, I felt like somebody who's completely new to any of this would have the same reaction to this that I had reading the Ragged Edge Best Of book 25 years ago. And that, I think, had a much smaller subsection of both disability and kind of other demographic categories across it, even though I think the goal was similar. And this definitely brings it up to date for the 21st century. So I thought this was brilliant. I will be lending this to people. As with anything that collects work from different authors, some will probably connect with you more or less. There were a few of these that, in addition to the first one, that I had read before, and a few others that were new essays written specifically for this, where I had read the author's blogs or memoirs, so they were a little more familiar. But as I said, this is definitely a book I will be lending to people, and it's great to see something updated, because I do have other books that I have lent to people, and they are all from between 20 and 25 years ago, so I love that I have an updated version. And yes, if you aren't familiar with disability rights, justice, culture, etc., I thoroughly recommend picking this up to gain some extra information. While I'm on that theme, I'm going to insert something I pre-recorded that I had to take back to the library because it's sort of on a similar kind of theme here. Alright, this is past me because I need to talk about this while holding it up, and I'm going to return this to the library soon. Hello, I Want to Die, Please Fix Me by Mehler Paperny. This is half memoir and half investigative reporting. The author is someone who has written for the Globe and Mail and a number of other Canadian newspapers, and she's also had long-term struggles with clinical depression and fairly severe clinical depression. And after she had experiences of being involuntarily committed after some suicide attempts, she did some investigation into mental health treatments, funding, medication, other non-medication and non-therapy interventions, things like that, and wrote this book. It is a fascinating look into a lot of those things. I thought the strongest parts were both the memoir and the pharmaceutical funding bits, because that was really fascinating. The memoir bits are quite strong and surprising in a lot of ways. I think a lot of her stories challenge a lot of the narratives surrounding depression, which was interesting. She is quite open about her history of suicidal thoughts and attempts, so if that's something that's going to be upsetting for you, this wouldn't be a book for you to read. But I think if you are interested in hearing about that, this was definitely eye-opening for me. The pharmaceutical stuff, again, was fascinating because I had not realized how much research. I think I imagined that there was a lot more academic or government funding behind a lot of research, whereas it is a lot of who's going to buy this and how are we going to fund it that way, based on the market for things. So that was really interesting. She goes through some bits and pieces about mental health supports, And she mostly focuses on the situation in Canada, which varies quite a bit by province, but she also looks into some things in the US and in Europe, and it ends up being a little too little of a lot of them, so it felt like there were a lot of minor points that weren't necessarily as well connected as they could have been. So I thought some of the investigative bits weren't quite as strong that way, but I was still quite pleased to have read this, just because it was very enlightening. I had no idea about a lot of the experimental treatments, and as I said, the memoir bits were just fascinating for me because it was very different from some of the other popular depression memoirs that I've seen. So yeah, this was fascinating. It was quite a quick read. She writes in a very, I wouldn't say 100% conversational, but she has a definite flow to the writing style, so that even when it is going through the non-memoir pieces, it does feel, it is a very smooth read. So yeah, that was interesting. Next up, I read Ibram X. Kendi's Stamped from the Beginning, The Definitive History of Racist Ideas in America. In the wake of the kind of, I don't know, mainstreaming of the Black Lives Matter movement, a lot of people have been talking about Kendi's How to Be an Anti-Racist, and Alba from Seriella and I both realized that we had this book that we hadn't read, so we thought we'd do a buddy read of it. This goes through the history of the United States from the colonial period to the current day, with each era following not exclusively one individual, but primarily focused around their lifespan or their activities within the world of racism and anti-racism. And so we go from basically the Puritans through to the current day. I thought this was very educational, in part because I knew nothing, for example, about the Puritan period of early settlement in the United States. There were huge spans of the 1800s where there were things that I had never heard of before, so I definitely learned a lot of American history from this. It also made me realize that the section that is around the point of American independence focuses on Thomas Jefferson, and that was really interesting, because most of my, I guess, knowledge of Jefferson is from when I lived in the DC area. I did go to his house at Monticello and took some of the tours there, and the thing about learning from that is it is educational, but you don't necessarily remember the facts exactly correctly, so that was really interesting to be updated on that. As it goes through, at the point that we hit the 1990s, it felt like there was a bit too much everything plus the kitchen sink in there, which was a little odd to me, especially because that's the section where it started to be things that I recognized. It was about movies that I had seen. He talks about like the Spike Lee biopic of Malcolm X, which when I was in high school we had a school trip to go and see that because I was taking a Canadian-American comparative history class when I was in high school. That movie was so long it had a interval in the middle of it. Anyway, one of the central points in here is that Kendi presents us with two different styles of racism, segregationist and assimilationist. And the assimilationist style of racism is of a form that explains a lot of colonialism that happened outside of the Anglosphere, and I'm thinking particularly, for example, in the Portuguese or Ottoman empires, where people could be part of the empire, and if they converted and changed their name, they sort of became part of the dominant group in a way that within British colonialism you just didn't see. And it kind of explains that to say, no, that's also racism. It's this other style of racism, which also and it also gives you a label for some of those people who are very racist and then claim they can't be because their partner or their children are some other ethnicity. That kind of gives you a framework for thinking about that beyond just the vague racist or not racist, which is not as useful. So as a whole, I found this really interesting and I was glad I read it. I did think one major flaw is that it is focused very specifically on blackness and whiteness, and if you were going to call something the definitive history of racist ideas in America, to ignore indigenous anything, to such an extent. There are a few mentions of indigenous people, but very, very few. And that just seems like, and I couldn't understand how you could call something definitive and have that gap there. So, not a fan of the subheading, but the book itself I thought was very educational and very interesting. So following up on that book, because the final section of that book, the person's being followed is Angela Davis, I then went and read some of her work. She was, I think, is stereotyped as having been a member of the Black Panther Party, which she was for a while, but she was more dominantly a member of the US Communist Party, which I had not known much about at all. So I picked up one of her works, which was Freedom is a Constant Struggle, which is a collection of essays and interviews, which was published about 5 years ago, so it's not necessarily the most current, given the current American political situation, but it is surprisingly up to date in a lot of ways. She does talk about the Black Lives Matter movement in the context of Ferguson. She talks about militarization of the police in the United States, also in Israel. She talks about the fact that the United States hasn't really reckoned with the imperial history and what that means with regard to national identity. She also talks about that in the context of Turkey. It was a lot more broad in terms of both the context and in terms of the issues that she talks about. The only two kind of nitpicky things, I mean, whether one agrees or disagrees with her particular politics, it is still very interesting to see them presented all together like that. So I did find that very interesting. The only two issues that I would have, one is that because so many of these are speeches, there are points in the text where she mentions, as she would have in the speech, I've run out of time. The additional things I would have talked about are. And very often the things that are cut off are the disability issues. She does talk quite a bit about gender and sexuality and ethnicity. And I did think it was unfortunate that that's always one of the last things that she talked about, so it's clearly not a priority in the same way, and I thought that had some unfortunate implications to it, but I mean, it is what it is. Also, at one point, she encourages people to feel free to jump into movements without doing huge amounts of research first. And she's talking about that in the context of Palestinian issues. However, after reading the other book, I did go and do some reading on her, and she, in the 1960s, encountered some controversy because she did in the 60s say some really, I would say, unfortunate things about political prisoners in the Soviet Union and in Czechoslovakia. And, well, you understand that given the context of the 1960s and what was known or not known, but she was going over there often. She was a member of the U.S. Communist Party, and it did make me think, knowing that bit of her history, the part where she says, you don't need to research before you get involved in activism, did make me think, research is kind of important sometimes. And I mean, and this is in a case where I don't actually disagree with the general political stance, but I just thought people ought to research. So that was a little odd. I was glad I read it. It was interesting. A different take on communist politics. I also read a graphic memoir, and that was Emei Burell's We Served the People, My Mother's Stories. The author is a Swedish cartoonist, and her mother is Chinese, and was a teenager when the Cultural Revolution started, and was one of the people who was taken out of school and sent down to work in a rural area. This follows her mother through the period of the Cultural Revolution, the years afterwards when people were trying to get themselves sent back home, which was quite an ordeal. The years afterwards when her mother was still trying to get an education, when most people were not allowed to if they were above a certain age, and then eventually to her mother's emigration to Sweden. The book starts out almost scrapbook style, so going through the first few pages, I almost expected it to be something like Nora Krug's Heimat, or Belonging, depending on what market you're in which you have almost a combination memoir scrapbook, but it does switch to being a traditional comic style fairly quickly. The art style is solid, but I think it's interesting primarily because it is a story. It is kind of unusually, I think, in the Cultural Revolution memoirs that you both read, and just talking to friends whose parents lived through the Cultural Revolution, a lot of those stories end on a kind of hope for the next generation, or hope for the younger siblings or the children or something like that, and less so for the people who had their educations interrupted and their lives disrupted in this significant way. And this doesn't do that. Her mother did get a degree and did get to emigrate herself and all of that. So it's a different take on it, and she does kind of muse on the elements of luck that had to happen along with the work that her mother put in, because there are both things happening. So yeah, it was an interesting read just because I think we almost come to expect a very specific style of Cultural Revolution narrative in which, for the people who were directly impacted, it's all bad. And in this case, it was mostly bad, but it wasn't completely terrible. So it was a surprise, but as graphic memoirs go, I don't feel like it was the most memorable of them on their own, and if it weren't for the specific subject matter of the author's mother, having a story that's just a little different from most of them, that is the outstanding point rather than specifically the art of the storytelling. Still, well worth reading just for that. And the art is definitely solid. So, again, something I'm glad I picked up. Alright, if you've read any of these, I'd love to hear what you thought of them. And, yeah, hope you're keeping well. That's it for now. Ciao.